Welcome to episode 5 of the 2024 Planning Congress podcast. In partnership with the Planning Institute of Australia, UrbanTalk is hosting a special podcast series in the lead up to the Planning Congress in Melbourne, which is taking place between the 22nd and the 24th of May. The 2024 Congress theme is Reinvention, Planning in a Time of Change, and it's all about how the planning profession can seize opportunities in this moment of change. In this podcast, we're inviting some of the Congress speakers to discuss their topics to give you an insight into what you can expect from the 2024 National Congress. My name is Belinda Barnett, and I'm the podcast host. In our last episode, we spoke with Petra Hurtado about the Foresight Program that's being run by the American Planning Association. Today's episode is a follow-up where we discuss Australia's very own Foresight initiative, which is being undertaken as a partnership between PIA and the consulting group Urbis. So if you haven't heard our previous episode with Petra, I encourage you to go back and listen. Today we're joined by two guests, Nicole Bennetts, who is the PIA State Manager for Queensland and the Northern Territory, and James White, who is the Research and Strategic Knowledge Manager at Urbis. It's great to have you both on the podcast, and welcome. The Foresight Program is a great initiative that's aimed at helping planners to be better equipped to manage change. Nicole, to get us started, could you share with listeners how PIA's Foresight Program came to fruition and what is the driving force behind it?
Yeah, thanks, Belinda, and lovely to be with you today and with James. So I think I will just start by saying foresight isn't a new concept, and it's not a new concept for PIA. Futures thinking is something planners do almost every day. And so PIA published a Foresight Report a few years ago. It was called Through the Lens, Megatrends Shaping Our Future. But this previous report is quite different to the current Foresight project we now have underway. The previous report focused on the trends that are affecting demographics and population growth and really supported PIA's advocacy around the journey towards 50 million Australians and really what that population growth meant for our cities, towns and regions. So this new report is much more focused on the planning profession and the trends which affect us and shape us as planners. So it's a really important project for PIA and something we really hope is valuable for the profession.
Fantastic. So I understand that delegates at the Congress are going to be given a copy of the new report, which is very exciting, and that information for the report has been gathered from a national survey. So James, can you tell us about the methodology that you employed for the survey? Who took the survey? And were there any other methods that you used to gather information to inform the report and to identify these important trends?
Yes, thanks, Belinda. I suppose from a starting point, we were very keen for this to be a project driven by the planners themselves and to have investment from the profession. Ultimately, here at Urbis, we undertook extensive background research, identified trends impacting planning, and there were over 200 that we identified. So we spent a lot of time actually categorizing those, and then we surveyed the entire membership of PIA, which I think was over 2,000. And we actually had over 500 responses to that, which was well within what we were expecting and hoping to receive. But ultimately, that drove us then to actually undertake workshops, which Nicole and I managed. And we're also currently looking at interviewing key experts in the planning field as well to actually inform our final report.
So Nicole, why is the Foresight Program so important for the planning profession?
Yeah, look, I really like the foresight process because it allows us to explore and imagine the future. With James, we explored what's likely, what's unlikely, and what's the so what for planners. And whilst it's true you can't predict the future, I think we wish we could, I think it was really interesting to unpack what's likely to occur based on past and present influences. And then that can help inform the decisions we make today and kind of bring some priority to future joint actions and planning for the future. So I think, in chatting with James, foresight can help us as a planning profession transition from a state of reaction to a state of being proactive through transformation and that change that's going to occur. It can really give us that ability to shape our future even in the most, of changing of times or turbulent of times.
That's so true. And I guess another important thing that it can do, it can help PIA identify, areas of additional training that planners need to put themselves through to keep up to date or to equip themselves better for change. So is PIA, taking those results and using those to inform the training programs and the seminars and their sort of educational offering?
I think the outputs of this report will help inform a lot of the priorities for the profession as well as PIA. So I think it will help us zero in on what's important as a profession that we are ready for, that we respond to. Our professional development programs are one aspect of that. How we influence the education of future planners is another aspect. What we advocate for on a state-based or national-based level is another aspect. So I think there are many ways we can use the outcomes here.
I also think that it's not just PIA's responsibility. We're drafting the outcomes report with planners themselves as individuals in mind into how they will actually take trends on board in their own professional lives and actually adapt their own thought processes and how they interact with their day-to-day work based on what are forthcoming trends. Because we've identified them in 3 kind of time frames in terms of act now, kind of prepare, and then learn and watch. And if there are those kind of future trends that might impact you in the future, if you're aware of them coming and you see something in your professional life that might actually impact on your decision making or how you'll actually upskill yourself, you have a more equipped kind of mentality to go, okay, well, I better get up to speed with what the impacts of that are and how that will impact my day-to-day work. So I think it's a dual thing. It's not just PIA kind of picking this up, it's planners themselves actually in a professional way, understanding what trends will impact on them moving forward in their professional lives.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree. It's almost like being able to pick up the report, draw a baseline in the sand for yourself, and then it's like a personal wake-up call as a planner going, okay, look, I really need to sort of pay greater attention to this in my area of work, whatever that area of work is, whether it's consulting or in government. So I think it's a great professional aid for all planners to be able to utilise. I absolutely agree with you, James. Let's move on to talk a little bit more about the survey findings and the report. I know that you will be sharing the full findings at Congress, and you may not want to give too much away today. James, are there any trends or interesting pieces of information that you've identified that you can share with us?
I think one of the most interesting things was, because ultimately there was a lot of research involved in this, because we have trends, you have to substantiate them in some way in terms of in-depth research and actually looking at what existing research there is. And whilst there is a lot of trend kind of identification, in-depth research, and particularly linked to planning and the urban planning profession and planners in general, it doesn't really exist in an Australian context. And I think that was an interesting finding from when we were actually doing the research, is that there's an absence there, which in itself is something I think is good for the profession to know, even those going to university, to understand that, that there are opportunities there to actually write theses on some of the gaps where there is a lack of information. But I think ultimately is how trends influence each other as well, that not one kind of trend will sit isolated all by itself. You'll have a climate change threat trend, which will inherently impact on things to do with the housing affordability, with cost of living, with future trends that are coming down the line as well. And I think that was kind of surprising how overlaying a lot of the trends are and how they interplay with each other. And the report kind of lends that as well, because we did initially, when we surveyed the industry, we siphoned them out into societal trends, technological trends, and economic trends, political trends, and societal trends. But trends don't sit like that. The only way we could actually categorize them to get a full suite of trends across the kind of environment we work within. But ultimately, our work, following the workshops and following the surveys, was actually to overlay those and see how they actually do work together. And we looked a lot at kind of the macro trends, I suppose you'd call them, rather than the micro trends, because you'll have one tiny trend that sits within that kind of bigger picture, which could be, a crisis. You could call the affordable housing crisis a crisis in itself, but there are other crises happening as well. And to actually band those together and look at those kind of all together as kind of a crisis trend, a trend in terms of that. So that's been one of the interesting things in terms of research, is how we've actually put them together and actually said, okay, well, collectively, these are a collective set of trends which have tangible links and are actually driving each other. And there was a very interesting, because we obviously we did the research and we started writing the report, and then when we were reviewing, we started moving trends around to a way that it would actually have a bit more of a narrative and a bit more of a flow in terms of how one flows into the other and how it leads to planning outcomes that are actually really tangible for even us internally. And obviously Urbis has a lot of planners nationally, and I think that will be one of the things as well that has been interesting, is actually surveying internally in terms of how the sentiment is around their own planners and their own consultants about how they feel about certain trends that we've identified and how it impacts on them, and getting that kind of internal kind of thought piece, I suppose, in terms of how we as professionals actually would interact with those trends. But ultimately it's been that kind of that identification piece has been really, really interesting. I think when you start thinking about trends, because we don't do that a lot, we think about the day-to-day kind of, oh, that setback is XYZ, that policy is impacting on what I'm doing. But thinking about those big picture, higher order things, how ecosystem catastrophes can actually impact on our future as planners, how, demographic shifts are actually driving changes in terms of what type of dwellings we live in the future of kind of dwelling typologies as well. Those kind of big picture things are kind of sometimes lost in our day-to-day work, and actually doing a project like this and actually looking at it, reading it, and actually having some insights specifically related to planning was a really, really interesting thing to kind of tangibly link back the really higher order trends that are impacting things we do all the time. And I suppose we're in a really interesting space where the world has moved on a lot and very, very quickly since the global pandemic, be that with technology. There's been lots of movements in terms of, activism with climate change. There's been a lot of change since PIA last went on this journey, and that's been interesting in itself, having a bit of a comparator with those megatrends that are identified in through the lens, whereas with this exercise now is obviously a bit more in depth and it's moved on leaps and bounds, the next technological revolution or the industrial revolution as we're in now. It's really interesting to look at those things and how even things like AI are going to impact on our profession, and that's exciting. I think that's one of the things, reading the report and writing the report and being involved in the research in the background, is it's kind of exciting to think about some of these things, because one of the things that was interesting in general was that people inherently think about trends in a negative light, and Nicole would probably agree with me that a lot of people actually approached it, that's a bad thing. But there's so many opportunities for us as planners and the planning profession to actually lean into things and actually look at a trend and say, what opportunity is there for planning? How can planning either adapt or lean into it to actually advance the profession or yourself as an individual? And that there's so much scope for positive change. And I think that's one of the key messages we've been trying to push across, because it was quite startling how many people just have a mindset about trends, and but there's so many good things.
Were you able to look at the impact of age at all? Do young people have a different set of trends to, say, older planners?
The workshops that we actually undertook were driven by the results of the survey, which were overwhelmingly the contributors and the people who completed the planners who completed the survey were of that kind of upper experience level, so that kind of 20 years plus. So we took that information away, and we kind of discussed with PIA as well, Urbis discussed with PIA, just in terms of what's the traditional kind of demographic makeup of your survey results. And we found that this was quite an anomaly, that generally it's much more balanced, or might be more weighted towards younger people actually completing surveys. And we were quite taken aback that it was very weighted towards that kind of people well into their career. We went away, and Nicole and I designed workshops to actually speak to a group of young planners to get more of that kind of youth perspective, because obviously the younger planners who are actually, might be at the start of their career or have less than 10 years experience, they're going to be the ones who actually have to deal with all these trends. The ones we've identified as future watch and learn trends, they're going to have to watch and learn and actually deal with and act on these trends that will be identified. So we were really, really keen to actually sit down and workshop, and we did so over 3 hours. We went through the results of the survey. We dug deep into what they meant to them, and there were key differences in terms of sentiment about things. One of those was equality. Equality was kind of pulled out as being kind of a macro trend by kind of people who might have been longer in the profession or might have been a bit older as well. Whereas younger people actually, and I think it's reflective of your stage in life as well. If you're being impacted by a rental crisis or by high, a cost of living crisis. If you're thinking about those on a day-to-day basis, you're thinking about those trends as impactful things that are really meaningful to you. Whereas I think when you're a bit more removed from the smaller trends associated with those, you think about it in a higher order, like overarching inequality, which is a good way to think about it as well. But I think that was really, really interesting to see that kind of difference in delving into the minutiae of what the trends mean and how they impact on people and planners, and how that actually could resolve itself, and how quickly we need to act on those. Because one of the key things we wanted to do with the workshops that we undertook was actually identify those kind of, where do you put that? Where do you put that trend? Do you think we need to act now? Do we need to prepare to act on it? Or do we need to just watch that trend, see how it works? And the majority of trends, I think, and Nicole, I'm not sure if you have more to say on this, but a lot of the trends were identified as being act now, or we just need to really prepare to actually act on those. And I suppose that's kind of the ultimate thing about trends, is that the further away they are, the harder it is to understand what we do with them or whether they're a concern at all. So once we went through that exercise, very few trends ended up in that kind of, we'll just watch that, that can do its thing for a while. We'll let it bubble and simmer. But it was all kind of, yes, we do need to prepare, or we need to act on the majority of the trends.
Nicole, were there any surprises or any particularly alarming trends that you discovered that are impacting or about to be impacting the profession?
Yeah, well, like James said, I think we did have a few conversations about things that may be perceived as negative. I think there were a few surprises for me, particularly in the workshops, how strongly the societal trends ranked. So we did an activity where we ranked the likelihood and the impact of these different trends occurring, to try and get some prioritization. And things like a lack of trust in government, public versus individual interests, the role of the expert, the need for bold leadership, all these kind of societal or political trends ranked really highly. And when I went into the workshop, in my mind, technology trends were going to be kind of the biggest disruptors. And I think what we saw play out in the workshops were societal and climate trends were really significant, but the technology trends were either perpetuating them, making them worse, or could help solve some of them. And so I think the technology trends almost intersected with the societal, and that's kind of James's picture around when we siloed them. Technology on its own didn't sort of rank really highly, but once you start to overlay it with some of these really concerning climate trends and as well as societal trends, then technology becomes even more important. Yeah, I think it just highlighted how interdispersed these trends are, and how we kind of need to understand them all, and that kind of being able to step back to see that bigger picture and not treat any issue in isolation is so important.
Yeah, it was interesting when I spoke with Petra. She indicated that from the work that they'd done, there'd been a rise in the citizen planner, and she saw that very much posing a problem for the ongoing relevance of the planning profession. So it's sort of a little bit similar to what you were saying as one of your societal trends that you've identified, that whole sort of concept of who is the expert here, or is there trust in the planning profession as being expert in solving and in strategic planning for our futures.
Yeah, and James and I have had a few conversations about how many of these trends have highlighted the importance to speak to the value of planning. And for planning to remain relevant, it requires us as the profession to really step in and become the leaders and navigate pathways forward where the community comes together with government and makes those decisions for the future. And I think technology really can be an enabler, but also, the rise of kind of the spread of social media messaging where you can get really negative narratives out there very quickly can actually work against, the bringing together and the collaboration of the different stakeholders. So I think that's where that tension exists. But certainly in our workshops with the young planners, that need for bold leadership, that almost there was a sentiment that the next 10 years could be the make or break of the profession. I know that sounds really dramatic, but that was kind of the feeling coming through.
With some of the open form questions we had, it because underneath the survey we had kind of pre-populated, but we had given everyone the opportunity to write their own comments. And there was one particular comment that stuck out to me in terms of going back to what Nicole said in terms of the next 10 years is make or break. Some people feel that the planning profession is already gone. And we had a comment saying, why are we even doing this survey? Planning is already in post-mortem phase. And having a comment like that underneath something that you're trying to build a bit more resilience, build positivity back into the profession, it kind of signals that, planners and planning need to take ownership of its own kind of path and bring that positive messaging back into it, because we do have the opportunity with social media, with all the platforms, with everything else. And there's some really great people out there who are actually doing, really, really good videos and content around what planning is, how it impacts on communities and people and citizens. And I think the more we do that, the more we spread that, we can actually counteract that negativity that's constantly perforating what we do in a day-to-day sense.
That's a good segue into, I guess, the next question, which is for you, James. Do you consider to be the biggest takeaways from the findings for PIA?
I think some of the biggest takeaways are that there are influences that accelerate all the trends that we've identified. So that there's a number of things, like climate change is obviously something that is rapidly advancing, and that's influencing a lot of trends, whether it's societal trends, political trends, and that as well with technology. Technology is going leaps and bounds and moving so quickly, and we no quicker and no sooner do we actually learn something in terms of technology that it's moved forward again, and you have to start learning something new again, or you're looking at a new disruptor. And I think those two together are really, really interesting just in terms of accelerating. But population shifts, but population changes, culture changes. The more population changes, the more we have to adapt our profession. And the fourth one with that as well is that kind of political landscape and the social landscape. The more they evolve and the quicker they evolve and the more they shift, the more we have to respond as a profession as well. And I think those key kind of overarching themes and drivers of change do change trends very, very rapidly. And we've seen that from looking at previous trend reports that even PIA has done, how quickly within, a very short time horizon, when you think of strategic planning, even looking forward in terms of 10 years, isn't seen as that far away. We usually look at a 40-year horizon. In a 10-year period, those trends that we looked at, and those might have been, mega trends, but they're still trends. But how quickly they've changed and how the world has changed so rapidly, and having accelerating themes like that actually advance trends in such a way, but actually understanding how they do that as well. And that if you have one thing that comes up in terms of, if you have a massive population shift, if you have a huge change in a group of people who might want something different, that's going to change all those other key drivers as well, and it will actually amplify certain trends too. But if the more we understand how trends work and how they can evolve and how they can shift and change over time, the more prepared we can be for the future, and the more we can strategically think about the future as well and what we might need, and those needs and wants in a planning sense. And I think that's really important. I think that's really valuable, and I hope that anyone who would pick up this report in the future will look at these trends and go, okay, well, that's here and now in 2024. When I look at this again in 2026, where are we going to be with that trend? Because you just need one little tiny dip or influx in one of those drivers to actually radically alter the outcome of that trend that has been identified. And I think that's a really, really important takeaway.
When will you be doing the next Foresight survey?
That's a good question. I think one of the key things is that we want to see how this lands. We want to see the response, and I think it's a bit of a test case. Do planners want this? Are they excited by it? I know I genuinely am, and I know a lot of people inside Urbis are as well, about actually thinking big picture, because with planning we tend to, particularly when you're looking at development applications and everything else that goes with being a day-to-day planner, you get so ingrained in the minutiae of detail. To actually pull back out and look at those kind of big influencing factors, it kind of makes you feel that my profession is really important. What I do is really, really good, but also that world influences far outside my control actually have an impact on my day-to-day work, because it impacts policy, it impacts legislation, it impacts the politics that govern what you do. And I think that, and I'd hope that we'd actually in 2-3 years time pick this report up, actually investigate where we've come from, how far we've altered or stayed on track in terms of the trends we identified, and actually identify the trends that will be completely different in the future. Because whilst we've identified a lot of trends within the report, we weren't able to include everything, because you'd just be having, okay, well, this tiny trend is one trend, and you can't really write a report like that, otherwise who's going to read it? But we've tried to identify a multitude of trends, and I hope that we'd in time come back to this and kind of go, okay, well, we were on point with that one. We actually had these interventions, or we actually looked at how can we actually as planning deal with that trend that comes in the future, but where are we going now? Well, what's next? And I think that's always a thing with trends. You never know. I'm not Nostradamus, so I can't factor the future into my foresight research, but I think that would be really, really interesting to come back and say, okay, well, I learned that actually has changed, and how do we alter planning to actually deal with that?
Is there a particular measure of success that you think should be applied to foresight?
I think it is. I'd like to know that people are actually engaging with it. I'd like to know that people are picking up the report, looking at it, taking trends and taking that kind of bigger picture kind of thinking back to their day-to-day work. And I think from a starting point, that would be a measure of success. The more people actually download the report, read it, interface with it. And I'd also like to think that we could look at some of the reports that have particular actions for the planning profession, that whoever is influenced by it could actually say, okay, well, and PIA have done a lot of work with actually advocating for, more education in planning. And we've identified that as a trend, that there is a reduction in numbers of planning courses around Australia. Why is that? Why are we doing that when we already have a skilled planner crisis on our hands? We're now reducing the number of educational degrees that people can take. Like, that's obviously a move in the wrong direction, but further advocating for that and changing the course to bring to light some of these trends that are a risk to planning. And if we don't deal with them now in the terms of the Act now, we actually need to get action. We need to do things that actually alter how the profession actually responds to trends. And I think that probably if you'd asked me this in a year's time, I'd probably have a better answer to measure of success. But from the starting point, I'd like to see as much readership as we can possibly get, that there is conversation at Congress around trends impacting on planning. And if people have a different opinion, not everyone's going to think that trend is an act now or a prepare one. Some people will put that in higher orders. And that's one thing we discovered when Nicole and I were doing the workshops, that we all think differently. We all have different passions. We all have different things that we factor into our judgments, and that alters where we perceive the urgency of certain trends as well. And we've tried to take that kind of medium ground where we've positioned things in, okay, well, the majority looked at that as being a key trend in an act now sense, and the majority put it here, but then there's always an outlier who will put it over here. But as many conversations as can happen around the trends and what it means for planning, I think that's good, because the more conversation there is, the more acknowledgement that it's not just about that singular policy that's coming into play. There are bigger things out there that are impacting our lives and our professional lives. And I think the more light that is shed on that, the better, and the more conversation. And I think in itself, if there is that kind of acknowledgement that planners do think proactively about the future, and we're not super reactive. That's not, we don't just react to change. We actually preempt it. We look at it. We say, this is how it's going to work. This is the impact we'll have on us, and actually put some action in place. I think that's a positive message as well.
And I'd imagine there's some of the trends, not that I've seen the report, but could actually become a really positive foundation for the making of new policy. So being able to provide that foundation and talk publicly about that foundation when new policies are going to be introduced just provides a greater level of, understanding for communities as to why policy is being driven in a certain direction. So I don't know, I'm excited to read it, because I think that's being able to provide, just more substance might be the wrong word, but just that another dimension as to why planners are introducing new policies or as to why they're making certain strategic planning decisions for a locale or for a region, I think, and being able to put that decision making back to trends, I think is really positive in the discussions that we can have going forward.
I totally agree. And one of the things that we kept looking back on when we were doing certain research into economic trends, for example, was the intergenerational report done by the federal government, because they actually look at trends that will impact on the economy, and that relates to everything from demographics to everything else. And there's a lot of other trend reports out there that we actually looked at too. And actually, why isn't planning doing this? Well, why aren't we as planners doing this? And I think that was a really good signal that there is a gap there in terms of we do factor all of this in some shape or form, but we don't document it, and we don't kind of write it down, whereas other entities do and other professions do. And we kind of led by example with that as well. And it was really, really great to hear and learn about the APA's approach to it as well. And how could we do that in Australian sense? How do we put an Australian lens on that? And that's such a good piece of research. And it was quite a challenge to not emulate it in such a way and kind of move away from, certain things they had done, because it was so good and so interesting and so all-encompassing. But then they do have a full research arm that looks at that. And Urbis, in partnership with PIA, we're just a small group of people who also have other jobs and other things to focus on. And I think that was a real value, I think, when we looked at the wealth of information that's out there, and that there are other professions that do look at trends, and there are other entities that do it as well. I think that this is going to be a really positive outcome, and I would hope that it will be perceived that way as well.
If I could just add to what James has said, I think identifying that this was a gap in current knowledge and current information means that when planners go to make evidence-based policy decisions or recommendations, that they're not currently able to draw on something like this. And so I would hope that planners will see this as a resource, as a evidence base that they can draw on when making recommendations about the need to make different climate decisions or different housing decisions or other kind of policy matters that are really important to planners. Because I think a lot of the evidence we rely upon is past. It looks to the past and it considers what's happened before, whereas this is, almost one of its kind, where it looks to the future and tries to look at what's likely to occur. So I think, using this and treating this as a piece of evidence when making those policy decisions will hopefully make better planning decisions.
I absolutely agree with you. I think it'll be an amazing resource for planners to be able to draw from, which sort of leads into this final question for you, Nicole. How do you see the Foresight Program, I guess, going forward? How do you see it expanding and improving the planning profession? What are your personal wants for its future?
I think the American Planning Association sets the global benchmark for Foresight and really treating it as an ongoing program of work. Personally, I would love to see that, but I think we have to, work within our resources, as James has mentioned. I think just the going through this process of thinking to the future has been so important. And, as planners, we often think about the future of our cities, towns and neighbourhoods, but how often do we really have the opportunity to think collectively about the future of our profession and take some ownership of that? And it's probably not often enough, in my view. And I think the Foresight structure gives such an opportune moment to have that coming together of that collective future. I think, like James said, I really hope planners engage with this report and use it for its outcomes, so use it based on what they need it for. PIA exists for our members, so the real test for this will be whether our members pick it up, whether it's useful for the planning profession. And then if it is, and we hear that feedback, we'll be able to think about the next iterations of it and how we can continue to tailor its outputs to suit what the planners need. So, if you're someone who would like to see PIA continue to invest in Foresight into the future, engage with it, share it, and provide feedback once it's released so that we can continue to look at how we improve it into the future.
So I definitely think it will get a very good response from the Congress. So that's my personal view. And certainly, look, I take on board your comments about the American Planning Association and their program. It is exceptional. I think people who are going to Congress and being able to listen to Petra talk about what they're doing will take away a lot of very valuable information, as will people that are coming and listening to you, James, talk about the report and the Australian findings. So I think it will be as I said, a really good wake-up call for the profession to hear these two topics being talked about at Congress. So I might bring our podcast to a close because I know we don't want to burst the bubble for Congress, but I have so much enjoyed speaking to you both today. PIA's Foresight Program will be vital in helping planners stay relevant and skilled to cope with the key challenges facing our profession going forward. The work you're doing is fabulous. And I'm certainly really excited to hear more about it and to get a copy of the report at Congress. So thank you so much for your time today.
Thanks, Belinda.
Thanks, Belinda.
If you have any questions, please email congress@planning.org.au. My name is Belinda Barnett, and thank you for listening to the 2024 Planning Congress podcast.